All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Trent Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Franklinton Board of Trade, and I am very pleased to welcome you to episode 2 of a podcast series that we're doing to celebrate the 225th birthday of Franklinton, or as we call it, Franklintennial. We're going to focus our 4 episodes on specific time frames in the neighborhood history, but each episode may have stories from different time frames that will get included. So we're not going to worry too much about that, but we're going to just try to focus on certain time frames. And the point of this effort is to really document amazing stories from our thoroughly informed and legendary guests for posterity, because these stories are too important not to have on record. And so in the first episode, we covered from 1797, the founding of Franklinton, to 1913, which was the first major flood that was a part of the modern time of the neighborhood. And now episode 2, we're going to focus from 1913 to 1980. And so the significance of that time frame is the end of the flood and then the beginning of the FEMA 100-year floodplain designation, which essentially froze the neighborhood in time for about the next 25 years after that. And so with me today, we have a couple of amazing guests, but first I want to thank Josh Clark and his team at Jimphia Productions for recording and producing this. Land Grant for letting us have their high energy space to do this in. Lots of fun, and I understand our guests like the beer so far, so we're in good shape with that. And then Jim Sweeney for his editing and directing of this effort, and then also to the Franklintennial committee for supporting the idea and getting on board with recording this information. So I want to jump in with our 2 guests now, and this is a real treat for me. I'm going to have a grin on my face the entire time because these are 2 of my favorite people in the entire world. They're both legends of the neighborhood. They're both just legends in general. But we have with us today Dewey Stokes and Bruce Warner. And so before we start with questions, guys, I want to just have you give us a couple minutes about your history in the neighborhood and a little bit about who you are, just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to jump into some questions and start the conversation. So Dewey, would you please go first?
Well, I was born really technically in the Short North by Sacred Heart, because that's where my mother went to school in her school days. She graduated from Sacred Heart. And so we moved down in Franklinton about when I was maybe 2.5 years old. And I've lived here all my life in Franklinton. I remember when I went on the police department, they were you had to fill out a background and say, where did you live? And I remember the interviewer saying to me, wait, Dewey, where didn't you live down in Franklinton? 1059 West Town Street, 663 West Ridge Street. I lived there until Sandusky Street was being widened, and they come in and tore down our apartments that were on the corner of Rich and Sandusky at the time, the Harrop's Market that was there. And it was just one of those things that you did. And I'm still attached to Franklinton. I, of course, am vice president of our board, the Franklinton Historical Society board. And I'm involved in my church, which is Holy Family down here, which is probably the second oldest Catholic church in Columbus area. And I went to Holy Family School until 1959, and I went out on the farm with my dad in Groveport, Ohio, and I graduated from Groveport, Madison in 1960. And then later on, I come up to Columbus, and I worked with a very exclusive business back then. Started a small business called a diaper service, and it was foreseeable. Should have stayed in that business because it correlated with what I did later in life, joining the police department. But and then I'll leave it to you to put all that together, and I think you'll get what I'm talking about subliminally. And I got married and raised 4 wonderful children. And I probably got the second best wife in the world.
Florence is a saint.
So everybody else has probably got their first, but I've got the best wife in the world. She's been able to put up with me for 57 years, and so it's interesting to see the development in Franklinton from inside. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of people look at McKinley Avenue, and when I see McKinley Avenue, I think of the old railroad turnaround that was there. And I remember seeing the big steam engines come in and putting them on the rack and moving them around. And
didn't they call that the turntable?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, it was a big thing. It was amazing to a young kid because we would ride our bicycles over there and look at that. And you remember the coal and all the things that was along McKinley Avenue was businesses, you know.
Yeah.
And there was a nice Mom's Italian restaurant on the corner that fed everybody that worked over in that area, I think. And her granddaughter lived in the row of flats that we lived in on Rich Street. We lived at 663 West Rich Street then, me and my brothers and my mother and father. So, we were there when the war broke out. That's where we stayed there till after the war. And I think the first tragic thing that I really remember from a government perspective was when they took the Rent Control Act off. Oh. During the war, you couldn't raise the rent, and and our rent back then was, I remember this distinctly because how it affected my mother, was $20 a month for the apartment, and we lived in a row of flats, two bedrooms, front room, kitchen, basement, and a backyard, but and everybody lived in there, had children, and I remember my next door neighbor, Juanita, her and her husband, she was related to the cooks that had the restaurant over there on McKinley Avenue at the time. And so it was interesting, the mix of people that lived in Franklinton then. And you know what? You didn't even realize it back then.
Yeah, it
was just your neighbor.
It was just
and
the
your
way
friend,
it was.
You know?
Yeah.
I remember I was talking to a lady the other day, and she said, "Where'd you grow up at, Dewey?" And I said, "Down in Franklinton." And I said, I went to Sunshine Park. She said, where in the world? Sunshine Park. Or I said Dodge Park first. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. But anyhow, I said I went to Dodge Park. Later, they named it Dodge Park, but it was Sunshine Park. She said, where was that at?
Yeah.
And I said it went from Sandusky Street to the river.
Yeah, and it's still there. Yeah.
And I said, that's where I played my first real organized sport there was baseball, and I was talking to Gary Jewell and some of the other guys and Bernie and them that played ball with us back then. That's where we played baseball at Sunshine.
Right.
And I played in that bantamweight football league over there.
Okay. Yeah. So it's clear that you have plenty of stories that we're going to be hearing about as we go on with this conversation. And the other thing I want to bring up is that you brought up a comment about rent. And I do just want to say, because I always talk about this, you're a landlord in the neighborhood currently. Yeah. And you're a wonderful landlord.
Thank you.
And you do a wonderful job, and you take care of your properties, and you keep the rents low for the people that need it. And so for that, you're a legend for a lot of reasons, but that's a big one in my mind. So thank you for that. Now, Bruce, tell us about your experience in Franklinton, a little bit about your history. I know it's got a lot to do with the railroads, so tell us about it.
I was born in Ashland, Ohio, and I lived there till my father was killed in the service, Second War. My mother just packed up and left. She didn't handle it very well at all, of course, which is understandable. And we moved to California, lived out there a year. I hated it. Moved to Findlay, where my grandparents lived, or my father's parents lived. And we lived there for 4 or 5 years. My mother was never happy. You don't realize this until you get to be 15, 16 years old. That's when you're starting to become adult, and you learn, you see things,
Picking up on the feelings.
Yeah. And she took me every place. I mean, I couldn't, she didn't date, she didn't do this. So she said, well, go to the movie. I had to go with her.
Yeah.
And I used to go to movies. And I remember one movie she went to was called Snake Pit. I was petrified. I must have been 9 years old, And it was had to do with mental illness. nothing to do with snakes. But anyways, she took me shopping, took me to looking for houses in Mansfield, and she took me to Columbus, and she bought a home in Columbus on City Park in German Village.
Right? Yeah.
It was a double.
Okay.
A double with a garage on both sides.
Pretty fancy back then.
Really fancy.
Yeah.
Especially with garages in Franklinton,
Yeah.
And she said, "Well, I can help pay for this house." I think she paid $8,000 for it, and her rent on the other side was $35 a month. We talk about rent, 35. This was 1950. Moved here in 1950, so I was 11 years old.
Okay.
And I started the school at Stewart Avenue School, and then went to Barrett, and then Columbus South, where I graduated, which I wasn't supposed to go to at the last because we had moved out on Oakwood Avenue, out into Marion Franklin's district. But anyways, that's where I lived at in formative years on City Park.
Okay.
And my mother sold it later on, got 12.5 for it. She thought she was a millionaire.
Oh boy, yeah, she gained.
See, now that house is worth. Oh golly, I don't really think about it. I remember a house on the street, close, because it did have water, but no outside. Had outside toilets. House behind us when we moved in 1950 had outside toilets in Franklinton, in German Village, and she sold for 12.5. Bought a house for my grandmother lived with us, and because of stairs and steps, what have you. So that's why I finished till I married, and went to work for. I was going to go to college. Well, that was a useless thing for me. But my mother wanted me to go to college, and I didn't want to go to college. And but I went to work with Lazarus to start before I went to Scarlet.
I remember you telling me that. Yeah.
And I walked in, first job, and there was a young lady sitting there at the table working, and this was in the back. This was not out in sales. This was in the back where we were in the receiving department. And I saw this young lady sitting there, and that was it. That was flat out it. And I chased her around, and I married that gal.
Yeah.
And
she was wonderful.
Yeah, that's Jan. Her name was
Yep.
Breeze. Janice Breeze was her name. And she lived on Avondale, 300 Avondale. And we was married at 19. I was 19. And, or maybe 18. Let me think about that a minute. I think I was 19. And we had a child there, and we lived with the in-laws in 300 Avondale into the 59 flood, which was an experience. We can talk about that later. Mm-hmm. And we were married for 56 years until she passed. And I worked for the railroad. I got a job with the railroad in 1959. Went to work in 59 and hired as a telegraph operator, if you want to believe that. But I did.
Wow.
And I worked power jobs. I was a freight agent. I worked a wire chief. I did some train dispatching. Then the guy asked me if I wouldn't like to travel for an instructor on the New York Central Whole Railroad. I took the job because anytime there was work, and I could better, I took it.
You were interested.
But my wife, Janice, would never move. Her roots were here, period.
Yeah.
And we bought a house in 61 on Hayden Avenue. And I owned that home until 1917, and I sold it. We'd done a lot of work, different things to it, and but I was
2017, right?
yes, 2017,
Yeah, okay.
not 1917.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm
All the way
sorry.
back to World War I.
And and I was very happy there.
Yeah.
And I really hated to lose my wife. And I married later on in 17. I married a gal who had moved here named Judy Box.
Yeah.
And she was a character in the neighborhood.
Oh yeah.
And we built a new home on Guilford, and we poured money into it. She had money, and I had my money put in, and we live there. We enjoy each other.
Mm-hmm.
We hold hands,
Yeah.
and we argue to be but we always come out at the end.
Well, the one thing that I can say about Judy Box is you never have to wonder what her position is on something.
No.
She will tell you.
Oh,
She will tell you.
Yeah.
And we all very much appreciate that. All right, so those were great introductions to the conversation. So this covers from 1913 to 1980. Like I said, the ending of the Great Flood, and then the beginning of the FEMA designation. But you mentioned it, Bruce. In the middle of that was the 1959 flood. And so I've got to believe you guys both have some pretty compelling stories about that experience, and what that meant for the neighborhood. And more specifically, I just kind of want you guys to talk a little bit about what was the effects of the floods. And you know, especially as we go from the 13 and the recovery, and then the eventual 59 flood that just kind of threw everything, you know, right back to where it started. If you guys can just kind of talk about that a little bit, and some stories that you can share about those experiences. And I'll have you start.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about the 1913 flood other than the results of it, and reading about it and understanding it, and getting the opportunity to talk to people about it. And my grandmother, remember her telling me that they were living out on Cypress, and she remembers the flood coming down through there and washing houses off the lot over to the
in the earlier episode, in the first episode, Doreen Sauer talked about the velocity of the water being a problem.
Yeah.
And so the washing away was a big deal.
The way it came, and then coming off of the hill.
Yeah.
And off of the hilltop and coming off the hill, and then hitting the streets there, and a lot of the houses were built up, and it kind of acted like a funnel for some of it, even down Broad Street.
Yeah.
And from what she said, and other people have told me since, and how that just swooped things away. It obviously increased the velocity of the water coming down the hill, and then it just decimated the area. And it took years for them to look at it and figure out why and how that occurred, and how the water come off of the creek up north through the state property, and coming over the river and breaking over. And then it was in that time when Congresswoman Price went to Congress, and Congresswoman Price come down, and I remember talking to her, and that was in prior to that, coming in and talking about how they were going to build that up to prevent that. Well, I think that flood in '59 perpetuated that, and then when they built the flood wall, and then you seen the property in Franklinton was preserved from that disaster ever occurring again. And so that's what brought Franklinton alive again. You know, businesses could thrive because a lot of businesses were decimated during the 13 flood for sure.
Well, I recall Mike Caradonna, who I'm sure you guys both know and remember well. His dad opened up his shop on Broad Street in about 1971, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And I remember him showing me a picture of the day that he opened the shop, and it was a shot from his shop at 1325 West Broad, looking towards downtown, and there were blade signs for businesses just all up and down Broad Street, cars everywhere, people on the sidewalks. And so, yeah, it was a much different time, and that decline from the flood, and then the FEMA decision is what really threw it into a tailspin.
Oh yeah.
And so, what can you tell us about? And Bruce, I'm going to ask you to jump in here. What can you tell us about being around when FEMA did that? What was the response? What was the shock of the neighborhood?
Well, it was huge. You couldn't do anything in Franklin. If you could only improve your property by 50% of the assessed value
Yeah.
of your home. You could maybe put a roof on, and that was about
it.
That was about all you could do. And I remember we built an addition on the house because my mother had become sick, and we had to move her in, and I built a 2-story addition house. This is after I had retired. And when I built it, I had to turn how much it's going to cost. And the gentleman at the city said, well, where's the labor cost? Because it can only be more than 50%. I said, well, I'm going to build it. So I can't help it. You got to have labor cost. So my wife, in her gracious, loving,
In her Jan way.
absolutely, she paid me 50 cents an hour to build that addition in the house. And this is what you had to do to make things work. But people, and you talked about Broad Street. There was all kinds of places down, all kinds of businesses.
Yeah.
And we talked about the 13 flood, and I think the 13 flood, people didn't have the means to escape.
Yeah.
I don't think they had the means, and so a lot of people stayed here, and some did flee up to the hilltop, and that was fine, they did. But in '59, most of the generation who lived here was younger, and they fled.
They shot up the hill.
Young, old people, old folks, stayed here, I think, because it was their home. They've been there for God only know how many years, and they stayed. And then even though the flood wall maybe came in afterwards, the houses when they left, the houses because you couldn't build it, you couldn't repair anything, so the houses fell into disrepair, and then the speculators came in, and house prices kept dropping, and the houses were in good shape at all, and finally, after the flood wall was built, that stopped, and then the speculators said, "Oh boy, we're going to have a field day. We're going to buy all these houses cheap." And they're going to make them be rich in overnight. Well, that's not what happened.
Right.
Probably East Franklinton. Anybody who bought property in East Franklinton, that's that portion from
315 to the peninsula.
Yeah, 315 to the peninsula. Out, they made out, but people who did that west of there lost their fanny pretty much early on.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talked about before we came on the air is the poverty that Franklinton has experienced for decades and decades. This has always been a low census tract, low income, challenged, just difficult area for residents. And talk a little bit about when the decline of the neighborhood really started taking shape from probably mid-'60s up through the '80s. Delphi closed, Timken closed. Talk about the number of people in the community that lost jobs all of a sudden. I remember, when I was a kid, I grew up in East Liverpool, Ohio. So when the steel mills closed in Pittsburgh and Weirton and all those places, nobody had a job. Everybody lost their job, period. So tell us about that. And I don't think it was quite that severe, but I know that those companies employed an awful lot of people. So can you talk about that?
I think there was a lot of a decline in employment because the stabilizing of the community, especially after the '59 flood, and how it hit Franklinton real hard too with the break of the dike out there on McKinley and coming across. I think the ones that suffered the most were a lot of our small businesses, like Quality Bakery that used to be at Broad and Sauter, and we lived on Sauter Avenue then, and 47 Sauter, and I know when after the flood came, it came into the basements and that and flooded, but then the next day the temperature dropped and it all froze. So the water lines broke. Everybody had to replace furnaces, and if you were renting, which we were at the time, Mom and Dad was living on there, and the three of us, you just had to go to work and make ends meet.
Yeah.
And that meant, shoveling snow or digging a ditch or helping
Yeah.
with that when you were 12, 13, 14 years old. And then there was a lot of people down here that had a lot of pride. You know, we had a real mixture of Irish, Italians, a lot living in Franklinton at the time. And so those people knew what hard times were about. And I think it was a pace setter for the youth at that time, looking at how hard you had to work just to get that 50 cents an hour or $1 an hour. And I remember we were talking earlier, and I remember the Johnny's old shoe repair shop. It used to be on West Broad Street there between Avondale and just east of Avondale. And, you know, you never threw a pair of shoes away.
Oh, no.
You took them up there and got them half soled and used to put cleats on the back to preserve the heels. And then Alex, the shoe man, was down on Grub Street. And that building that Alex was in, still there. You know, you went in and his shoe shop was in the front of the business. He was an old immigrant from the war. He was German and came in, and Alex was in there. And I'll never forget walking from Rich Street up to Holy Family School. You'd walk by there in the morning and you could hear click, 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 click. He'd be down there cleaning shoes and polishing off the heels of shoes and stapling them. But that was the only place my mother took shoes to be repaired when we were growing up.
So back in the day, Franklin had 2 shoe repair shops.
Yeah,
That's pretty cool.
And I tell people today, when they talk about working together, the one on Broad Street was Italian family owned that, and then Alex was over on Grub Street. Those 2 shoe repair, and then all the businesses were kind of local. Little small businesses. Yeah. We had a bakery on Sandusky Street we was talking about earlier today. I remember going there and getting cream-filled Bismarcks for 3 cents a piece.
Yeah.
And you could get cream-filled donuts for 3 or 4 cents a piece. At the beginning, that was I remember the guy that owned that, him and his 2 sisters ran it for years. And my mother worked at a bar on the corner. And my stepfather drove a taxi cab back then to make money, make ends meet. And, you know, if he came home and said he made $2 in tips, that was a good day.
That's a big deal,
That was a real good day. And I learned from him, you know, where you made the most money driving a cab was short runs.
Yeah.
35, 45 cents. You cooked up 20 or 30 customers, and you hung around places where they were having a business, you know.
Yeah.
If he knew was having a sale at the bakery,
hang out
and he
there.
was working.
Yeah.
He hung out there because the people went in, bought more than they could carry, so they'd pay the quarter to get in the cab to go home.
That's smart.
And so, you know, that's when we lived there we lived at on the corner of State and Sandusky back then.
So Bruce, what can you add to this?
Well, he's right on. You know, I went to work for Lazarus in 1957. I made an amazing salary of $45 per week.
45 a week.
And my wife, who I met there, you know, she made $40 a week. And we paid taxes on that money. You know, now it wasn't much, but we paid, and you had an income tax return to make. So we didn't make much at all. You had to watch what you're doing. But would you believe if I told you there was a hat shop who sold just hats on West Broad Street?
Wow.
There was.
I believe it, and I wish it was still there. I love hats.
And there was just all kinds of small businesses, like you said. And everybody did repair their shoes.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, this thing come along called athletic shoes.
Yeah.
And you're no repair.
Chuck Taylor's.
Yeah. And and I remember the early ones were no soles. The old original ones, the old tennis shoes, they had no soles to them at all. It was like this flat rubber at the bottom.
Wow.
But I loved living in that time. I did. I didn't get home much. I worked so much at the railroad, and I was gone so much because I traveled for 2.5 years. My work was a lot of time with nights, and my seniority was from Corning, Ohio, to Toledo or Stanley Yard, And so I was going to call for in those places, particularly in the extra board. The regular positions were hard to come by, and it was all seniority. My first regular job was a suitcase job, where I had to work one night every place. Different place, and had to go between each place. And then that was one night was at West Columbus. When they closed West Columbus office for the operator, I had to leave.
Yeah. Well, something I want to ask you guys about, because I brought this up with Peter Kosha in our first episode, but we're on the verge of the start of the baseball season, and I love baseball. And Bruce, I know you love the Clippers, and I know you have some stories about Jet Stadium, Redbird Stadium, and then Jet Stadium, and then Cooper Stadium.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us some stories about, because I know you told me about the knothole game.
Yep.
And so I know you both probably can tell a story about that.
You bought your knothole ticket at school. And as I recall, it was 25 cents or maybe 35 cents was a knothole ticket. And that got you into
Saturday.
we got always matinee games.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was
Saturday.
maybe 8 games.
Oh, yeah, at least, yeah.
A game per year. And you'd sit and had a separate. And then when I was 15 years old, the spring of 1955, I worked for the scout department on East Broad Street. And I went to work at night, and the guy who run the place said, "You got your uniform?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Is it clean?" I said, "Reasonably so," because I had to wear it when I worked there. And I only worked there like 2 hours a night, 2 hours a day, but it was, I think I got 50 cents an hour or 35 cents an hour, something like that. And he just put it on. You're going to be on TV. And it was Channel 10, and he took me up there. And I went up there, and he said, "You're going to be on TV." And this old man sitting there, and I thought, I wonder who he is, And it was Hank Gowdy.
Wow.
Hank Gowdy, and he told me this about this badge, this big check. And the Jet badges in 1955 were huge. They were big, they were large, very large badges. Next year they were smaller. And the scouts would sell them for 75 cents, and they got to keep a quarter. Okay? And that was fine, So that's why I was there with the scout uniform on. I was petrified, just petrified. Mr. Gowdy said, "Don't worry, son, I'll take care of you." And they got me out there in camera, and I shaken to death, And he did. But I tell you how stupid a 15-year-old kid. I never got his autograph.
Oh no.
Never did. And he said, and I didn't get his autograph. But that was so that was 1955, the spring of 55, before the Jets took over. And I did get a few, but my work, I couldn't go much. But when I got older and I got some time, I used to go to the Clippers game. My mother-in-law was a huge fan, and she went to multiple games. And I'd go with her. My wife wouldn't go. Janice wouldn't go. My mother-in-law would go. So her and I'd go to the ball game. And we always sat in the aisle right front. And she was the nicest lady you'd ever want to meet. Never said boo to anybody. But if you walk by, that was fine. But if you stop and stand in front of her at the ball game,
So she can't see?
She had you right now.
That's not going to happen.
Nope.
That's great.
It was wonderful. I really enjoyed the games and watching the people. He's always sat underneath the net.
Yeah.
And I had some wonderful stories about the game, but I really enjoyed the people and the game.
Well, I remember the very first time I ever met you was at a Clippers game. Jim Sweeney and I went to a Clippers game, and he said, "Hey, Bruce is going to be there. We'll find out where he's sitting and sit next to him." And that was in probably 2006, maybe,
Yeah, probably.
something like that. And so, yeah, that's always my first memory was being at a Clippers game and you talking about the game. So that was a lot of fun.
When you talk about the Clippers and what they did, going from the Columbus Redbirds, to the Clippers, and then how it affected the neighborhood.
Oh, my.
But a lot of people nowadays forget, that Hop Cassidy was born and raised down here in Franklinton.
Yeah.
He went to Central High School. went to Ohio State, and you know the history of him. He became a Heisman Trophy winner, but he was also a coach over at the Columbus Clippers. He coached down at first base, baseball coach over there, and my mother got a job working in the concession stand over there. So when I was a young lad, 12, 13 years old, to go over and empty trash and do things like that, and I got in the game free. And, and Hoppin' them was where I think he graduated in 60 or something.
Oh, no, it's more.
More that, 55.
He graduated before I did, so maybe 55.
55, yeah. And so from Central, and then go over there. But there are so many historical connections in Franklinton with the community and the people that came here. Just like we was talking about the Florentine earlier, and how Joe and his family started out, built that from a little restaurant to a really nice restaurant. And then some of the other, we was joshing about the shoe shops and that, but shoe shops back in the early days in the 40s and 50s was essential.
It was a necessity.
You did not throw shoes away, if your mom knew about it. And then Lazarus, when we was talking about Lazarus, people today wouldn't think about walking from Franklinton downtown, but we used to walk up there at Lazarus just at Christmas time to see the display at
they had such a big display.
What Lazarus did up there then. I mean, it was a sight. So there was a newspaper stand at Town and Sandusky. It was a Citizen Journal. And we used to go there and get Citizen Journals and go downtown and sell Citizen Journals and then Citizen Journals and that on Saturday night for Sunday morning's paper. You could sell them up there. And, no one, the police didn't come up and say, you can't sell newspapers here or that.
Yeah.
As long as there was only 2 or 3 of you, it was great. You sold them there, and you went out to Miramore Candy when they had big thing going out on Broad, and walk out there and sell it. That's what I say today. Some people lack the initiative to go out and do those things. And growing up down there in Franklinton, in the winter you shoveled snow, and in the summer you cut grass.
Cut grass, that's right.
If you wanted to make 10 cents of grass or a quarter of grass, that's what you did. But, we had great community with Sunshine Park down there and Glad Community House that used to be at Grubbin Town.
Yeah.
And when Mr. Bogart and his family was there, that was another great place. But they seen at Christmas the kids and that were taken care of with Christmas baskets and that.
Yeah.
And the Boys and Girls Club opened up on Gift Street in 1949. And I remember the thrill of my life was Bob Hope came there, and he was popular at those days.
Oh, sure.
And opened that boys club, daggone it slipped my mind now with the CRS. But the insurance company, Mr. Ginger, Paul Ginger, Paul owned the insurance company on East Broad Street there at Washington and Broad. And Paul was a big supporter of the Boys and Girls Club at the time. Supported the Little League baseball and basketball teams that we had in there. He and the Dutch uncles that used to have, when we had the carnival at Sunshine Park later, they had a carnival there, and on Saturday they had a Dutch Uncle Day. And all the kids from Sunshine Park, the Glad Community House, the Boys and Girls Club went to that.
Yeah.
And you rode the rides all day for 10 cents.
That's awesome.
And it was just, that's the community, but the whole community together.
Yeah.
Business and the kids.
Yeah, and that's what we still try to do today is keep that all cohesive, collaborative unit. So I think an interesting thing to hear about you guys have both been around here a long, long time and have many, many stories. How did you guys meet? How did you first meet Bruce? Well, do you remember?
I do.
You do?
I do. We're going to go back to Carol Stewart.
Carol Stewart.
Yeah.
Another legend.
After I finished, retired, and I finished this 2-story addition house, and it's September.
For 50 cents an hour,
50
right?
50 cents an hour. Yes, I did.
One on Hayden?
On Hayden.
On Hayden Avenue,
No,
59.
164 Hayden.
164.
And I said to my wife, I always loved history. And I said to my wife, Janice, I said, they got this historical society down there meeting down there at the library. Let's go down and see what that's all about. Mm-hmm. So down we go, and Carol Stewart said, "Who are you?" And I said who I was. "What do you do?" "I'm retired." That was a mistake.
Yeah, don't tell her
Oh,
that.
she
No.
she started, and that's got me drug into it. So I involved in the Franklinton Bicentennial, the Columbus Bicentennial, the Ohio Bicentennial, Franklin County Bicentennial, all that stuff, you know. And involved in this Franklinton Bicentennial, I met this guy named Dewey Stokes.
And you never forgot it.
And I think the biggest one I can remember was we went over, and somehow or other we were involved in the lighting of the steeple at Holy Family.
Okay.
Yep.
And we got over there, and something happened. We couldn't get it lit.
Oh, no.
Dewey was there, and I really didn't know Dewey. And Carol said, "Dewey, can you talk about that?" Well, boy, did we talk about that. Dewey is like a sometimes doing that. That's not a derogatory, Dewey, but he's like a motor. You got to turn him off.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful. He talked and talked and talked about the steeple. It was wonderful.
Yeah. That's I love that story. I love that you remember that.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Lighting in the fire.
Dewey, you have told me some really cool stories about when you were a police officer, and it's not technically about Franklinton, but you told me a story about when you had to patrol the tunnel that ran from the prison to the State House because it was a heating duct.
Yeah, that was that,
So
that was when they had.
Can you retell that part?
The prison, they had the riots at the prison, the old Ohio Penitentiary prison, and they were up. The prisoners were in outrage, you know, at the time, and that there was a tunnel that ran from the prison over, and they were afraid that they were going to get in that and come across under the street and all that and over. It was a heating, as I recall.
Because they had a furnace that they stoked at the prison.
It
that
they
blew over.
Yeah, power plant. Yeah,
They had the power plant,
Yeah.
the city power plant, and that heat from there, which would heat when it crossed underground and heated part of the prison. And they were afraid that they were going to come through there, so they blew it up. The tunnel collapsed.
they
the
did?
tunnel
Interesting. Wow.
underneath. They collapsed the tunnel underneath.
But I remember
to
you
prevent
telling me
that.
that you and your fellow officers would have to patrol that with rifles and bayonets.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
back
That's,
then,
that had to be a little spooky.
Yeah, that was a tough time in the dim days back in that. But it was things that other people didn't know, but it prevented a lot of injury and death, I think.
Yeah.
But what they did there at that prison at that time, so it was a lot of good direction. But I think people that were in charge in those days were more conscientious about things like that.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody talked about it. It's just the way you was
Yeah.
raised and that what you did, you know.
You know, something I'd like to ask you guys is you have seen a lot in this neighborhood, and you've got a lot of great stories, and you've suffered a lot of challenges, a lot of hardship, and you know what that's all about. What do you like about what's happening now? You come to this table today with such a wealth of history. What do you like about what's happening now? What encourages you? What gives you hope about what's going on in this community today?
Well, I think anytime you forget history, you're detrimental to the future.
I
We
agree.
take history and we learn from history. I don't care if you go back to the Roman Empire till today. You take that knowledge that you gain and you bring that forward and you build on it. And Franklinton is just another community from 1792.
97.
97, thank you. And so you come in and you start at that point and you come forward and you see what we took, what this land was and how that land was developed over the years. And then you come back. Some people today just want to come in and decimate the history. And that's what drew me to learn a little bit more about history and getting involved in the Franklinton Historical Society. And I sat on our FOP and on a history side of that Franklinton and preserving the history of law enforcement in the country. But here in Franklinton, preserving that history is the basis of education, I think. You know, you learn from the past. The structure, the streets, the roads, the businesses, all that community is the thing that you're trying to preserve right now. If we had the community the same attitude, I think, that we had, right, especially after the war, and you've seen a lot of immigrants coming into our community. You know, you had the Irish, the Germans, and you say, oh, the Germans were in German Village, the Irish were, you know.
They were collective here, though.
They were collective, you know, and you celebrated those days and that together. You were glad that those people were able to escape out of Italy and come here.
Yeah.
They're the people that left Germany and left their families. You see what's going on today in our news today, and it's disheartening that we as a world didn't step up and say, we're not going to let that happen.
You know, I love what you just said, because, you know, the way I kind of look at it is that was back when society was willing to go through trial and error. You know, you had to try something because you didn't have any other option. Right. And it was just that understanding that we're all into this together. If this neighborhood floods, we're all flooding. Yeah. And so we have to figure this out. So, yeah, I like what you said. And, Bruce, I want to know what you would have to add to that.
Not a whole lot. You know, my wife, she's in essence is an immigrant. She come to the States from Australia in '72, and then was there at Salt Lake City for a couple of years, and then went to Athens, Ohio, as an emergency room physician in Athens. And then she moved to Columbus and went to school here, and she met her first husband here. She finally moved. I'm going to try to reach for this date. About 2000, 2003.
That sounds about right to me.
To
yeah.
Franklinton.
Yeah.
And she says to me, this is the first time that she feels comfortable.
Yeah.
She likes the people here in Franklinton. She enjoys it. She enjoys the diversity of people.
And she always references that she can have a clothesline. She can have chicken. She can do, you know, it's like Hilliard, you couldn't do that. Dublin, you couldn't do that.
And she likes people. Right now we have a lady, we got an Airbnb in the basement. Yeah. And we got a young lady living there right now who is a student at OSU. And she is a refugee, or she got out, I should say, from Cuba.
Oh, wow.
She escaped.
Yeah.
They sent her to Venezuela, in essence, almost captivity, to be a dentist there. They give her enough money, pocket money, and all the rest of the money she earned went back to Cuba. Yeah. And she got away. She escaped from there, and she made her way to the States. And now her mother got out. Of course, they didn't care much about her mother because she's old and get rid of these people. So she got out. So we've got this young lady living there, and it's so interesting to have people. We had an Airbnb. We had all kinds of different guests, and they're so interesting. And some of them were immigrants. Some of them were second generation here or first generation here. And when Jude and I travel, we go to see the big tourist trap, so to speak, for a day, maybe two, and then we go out into the countryside,
the wild,
and it is amazing.
I'll bet it is.
And we really enjoy that. We enjoy people. We enjoy stories. We enjoy what they say, you know, and you listen. You'll learn a whole bunch, you know.
Well, I'll tell you what, you guys, you two are the two people that I enjoy listening to the most. You have story after story after story, and every single one is more interesting than the last. You know, and so I appreciate you guys being here and sharing with us.
I just wanted to say, you know, when you look at the community, I grew up down here, and I look at Mike Dorian and Hugh Dorian, the Dorian family.
Campbell Avenue, right?
Yeah, and you know they live right there next to old Bellows Avenue School, right on the other side. And I remember their father, white-haired man. But the whole thing is, you had the Dorians era, and you look at the contribution he and Donnie Woodland and the old guys that were here, how they came and worked together, Democrats, Republicans, and we were all Democrats then. And you know, it was a neighborhood that prospered because of the foundation that those people worked and laid. And you look at the contribution that just Hugh Dorian made to our city.
Yeah.
And
he's a legend
and made
in
this
his
a
own
great
right.
city. The foundation of that, and to be able to come from this area and be able to be elected to an office, and I suffered through the same thing for a few years as a county commissioner. But you know, those contributions to the community were a privilege. Not a right. Yeah. It was a privilege to serve the public and be able to give something back to the community at a much broader scene than you can as an individual.
And it's a time when collaboration and compromise were not dirty words.
Absolutely.
That's right. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's that's how we got the flood wall. That's how we got that's how we got a stabilized economic.
Could you imagine the
city.
flood wall trying to get built today with all the fighting that would take place? Could you imagine how hard that would be?
Who was the Stiziano?
Mike
Stiziano
started the he and
Deborah Price. And
before Deborah Price.
Oh, it was before her? Okay.
And then he passed her. He'd passed it, and Deborah Price picked it back up again.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And carried it forward. And wouldn't have been for people working together, Democrats and Republicans, which you don't see.
You just don't see it.
It's disheartening.
You guys come from the era when that was commonplace and things actually got done.
You agree to disagree.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you know, as we kind of get close to wrapping this up, I think that's something that I believe we want to highlight with this podcast series is that even though we have that type of fighting in general, just in the nation, in the state, this neighborhood still collaborates.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Board of Trade, the Area Commission, the FDA, the Arts District, you know, we're all in the same boat. We all get that.
Yeah.
That analogy is not lost on us, and it's because of guys like you that led the way originally that makes it that way.
We got to row that boat together.
You come into it now. What makes this a great community and the opportunity to be a great community is one, preserving some of the past and the historical, but looking at the art district that's come here, the breweries, the small businesses. The small businesses are still the backbone of our economy.
No doubt.
If we don't take care of the small businesses and patronize those businesses when we can as individuals, when one individual does it, you don't feel the impact, but you feel the impact when 50 or 100 come in and help each other.
That
like
is
this
exactly
small
right.
business here, it thrives, and it'll thrive on the support from the community.
And they give tremendous support back.
And they do. And this is another perfect example of
Yep.
it. Then they come in and they help at the schools or they help with projects and educating individuals. When you're educating the kids in school or the kids in the neighborhood, they don't have to be in school to get an education. Give them the opportunity.
It's not all about the teacher in the classroom.
No. It's about giving them the opportunity to earn that first dollar
That's right.
that they can go out and buy what they want, and they can go home to mom and dad and say, I earned this money. I'd like to get me a pair of Converse All-Stars now.
Yeah, and that's fine.
And that's the way to do it.
Well, you guys are the epitome of that, and I'm gonna do some housekeeping things, and then we're gonna do something a little special here.
Okay.
Anything you guys want to add before I wrap this up? I mean, we could spend 3 days talking to you guys, but any last comments?
You know, I think what it is, coming together and seeing the collaboration of some of the social service agencies, but the collaboration of the community, the people that make up the community, whether it's in Franklinton Board of Trade. I think when you're able to help other people, truly help them, that's the greatest reward.
I've been involved in the FDA for quite a few years.
And I'll say for the audience, that's the Franklinton Development Association.
Yeah.
And all I ever wanted to see was people in homes. And reasonable prices. And I know a lot of people would think, well, gee, it's too much. we couldn't do for less. But we put a lot of people in homes. We provided a lot of nice places.
Yeah.
And I was always proud of that.
Well, I'm proud of you guys. I'm proud that you accepted the invitation to be here, because it truly is an honor.
Thank you.
So hang tight for a second. I'm gonna wrap this up, and then we're gonna do something special.
Okay.
So I want to thank everybody for tuning into this second episode of our podcast series celebrating Franklintennial, the 225th birthday of Franklinton. I want to thank Josh Clark and Mike Cash with Jim Fia Productions. They're the ones recording this and filming it, and we're going to put it all together. Jim Sweeney, this was his idea, and I was crazy enough to go, hey, that's a good idea. And
One
so,
good Irishman.
yeah. And so Jim's going to edit it down, and we're going to add some B-roll. So a lot of the comments that you guys made, we're going to layer in some pictures that go with that. And Bruce will probably be coming to you for some of those picture things. And I also want to thank Land Grant for being our host today. We love being in their high energy atmosphere here, and it's the perfect place to do a podcast. So again, I want to hold up the Franklintennial logo. This is for the celebration of the 225th
anniversary.
And so we want to make sure that everybody stays in tune with that, because we'll have events, educational programs coming up, all kinds of art installations and things of that nature to celebrate us getting to this milestone of a birthday. So thank you for being here. And the last thing we're going to do, fellas, is Dewey, you have a beer right there. Bruce, you have a beer right there.
Oh.
And I happen to have a beer right here. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here today.
Thank you.
And for making this so special.
Thank you, Dewey. Hey,
Thank you, Bruce.
Here's to you.
to you.
Here's a
See you on the third episode.